The boy had always been the quiet one, the kind who blended into the background without anyone noticing. He wasn't shy because he lacked thoughts or feelings. He simply didn't know how to fit into a world that moved too fast and spoke too loudly. From the time he was small, people around him had gotten used to saying the same thing whenever he tried to speak up or express himself. Keep it quiet. It became a phrase he heard so often that it felt like a rule carved into his life. He lived with his parents and an older brother who were busy most of the time. His parents worked long hours, and his brother was everything he wasn't: outgoing, loud, and always at the center of attention. Whenever relatives visited, they praised the older brother for his confidence and energy. The boy usually sat in a corner with his small, second-hand keyboard on his lap, playing it softly so he wouldn't disturb anyone. He had bought that keyboard with the little money he saved from doing neighborhood chores. It was scratched, missing a button on the side, and some keys didn't work properly. But it was his most valuable possession. He never told many people about how music made him feel. Whenever he played, it was like the noise of the world melted away. He didn't need to speak loudly or force himself into conversations. The keys spoke for him. He figured that if he couldn't express himself with words, maybe he could express himself through sound. But even then, he would play so quietly that no one ever turned their head or asked what he was working on. At school, he wasn't bullied, but he was overlooked. Teachers knew he was smart, but they rarely called on him because he barely raised his hand. His classmates didn't tease him, but they didn't include him either. During breaks, he'd sit under a tree with his keyboard, practicing little melodies he made up on his own. A few students would walk by, glance at him, and shake their heads as if they thought he was wasting his time. One boy once said, "Why do you always sit with that thing? Nobody listens." The boy didn't answer. He simply lowered the volume and kept playing. At home, it wasn't much different. Whenever he tried to show a song he created, someone always seemed too busy. His mother would say, "Not now, maybe later." His father would nod without looking up from his work. His brother would laugh and say the music sounded too soft to be real music. After a while, the boy stopped trying to share. He learned to enjoy the music on his own, late at night in his room when everyone else was asleep. Despite how invisible he felt, he never gave up on music. Every day, after finishing homework, he would sit by his window with the keyboard resting across his legs. He practiced the same melodies again and again, not because someone asked him to, but because he loved the feeling of becoming better. He learned by listening carefully to songs online, copying the rhythms and patterns, and slowly developing his own style. He wasn't perfect, far from it. Sometimes he made mistakes, sometimes his fingers slipped on the keys, and sometimes he got frustrated because the sound didn't match what he imagined in his head. But he always tried again, and with each passing day, he became more confident with the way he played, even if no one else noticed. One afternoon, something unusual happened. His class was told that there would be a community talent event in the town park. It wasn't a competition, just a place where people could perform for fun. Some kids in his class immediately began planning their acts: dances, comedy, little group performances. The boy thought about playing his keyboard, but he didn't dare say it out loud. When the teacher asked everyone what they wanted to perform, he hesitated. He imagined raising his hand, saying he wanted to play a song, and the entire class turning to look at him. He imagined them whispering, wondering how the quiet boy who barely spoke could stand on a stage. His heart beat faster just thinking about it, so he kept his head down and said nothing. But that night, lying awake in his bed, he couldn't stop thinking about it. What if he did play? What if, just once, he let the music be louder than the voices that always told him to stay quiet? He wasn't sure if he had the courage, but the idea stayed in his mind. Over the next few days, he watched everyone rehearse during lunch breaks. Groups practiced routines. Someone brought a guitar. A few kids prepared speeches. And every day, he sat in his usual spot under the tree with his keyboard, pretending not to think about the event. Then one afternoon, a girl from his class walked past him and paused. She listened for a moment while he played, then said softly, "You're really good." He froze. No one had ever said that to him before. The girl gave him a small smile before running off to join her friends. But her words stayed with him. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, someone could actually enjoy his music. That one simple compliment changed something inside him. He didn't suddenly become outgoing, and he didn't rush to sign up for the event, but he practiced with more purpose. He began shaping a song he had been working on for months, adding little details, adjusting the tempo, making it flow the way he imagined. Still, even with the progress he made, there were days when doubt returned. Every time someone walked near him while he was playing, he would lower the volume. Every time he thought about the stage, he imagined himself freezing in front of the crowd. And every time he remembered how often he had been told to be quiet, a part of him wondered if performing was even worth trying. But deep down, he knew something important. Music was the only place where he didn't feel small. When he played, he wasn't the quiet boy anymore. He wasn't the kid who sat alone or the one people ignored without meaning to. In those moments, he felt like he belonged to something bigger, something that didn't require loud voices or bold personalities. As the day of the event approached, he noticed that the organizers put up posters all over the school and the neighborhood. Everyone he knew seemed excited. At home, his brother talked nonstop about a group performance he was part of. His parents said they might stop by if work allowed. The boy didn't say a word about his own thoughts, but inside, his heart was restless. He imagined the stage, the lights, the crowd sitting in the park. He imagined plugging in his little keyboard, taking a breath, and letting the first note ring out. He imagined people turning their heads not because he made a mistake, but because the sound surprised them. And even though fear still lived in him, another feeling slowly formed beneath it: hope. A quiet, gentle hope that maybe the world would finally hear him. Not because he shouted, but because he played. In the days leading up to the event, he practiced every evening, sometimes until his fingers grew tired. His music became stronger, clearer, and more confident. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he kept going anyway. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he believed that maybe this was his moment, his chance to show who he truly was. And even if no one understood him, even if no one paid attention, he knew one thing for certain. For the first time in his life, he wasn't playing to stay quiet, he was playing to be heard. The days leading up to the community event passed slowly, yet every moment felt heavy for the boy. Ever since he heard about the talent show, his mind had been tangled with thoughts, some filled with hope, others filled with doubt. He continued practicing, but with each passing hour, the idea of performing in front of people felt more real, and that reality made his heart beat faster than he wanted. School was buzzing with excitement. During lunch breaks, the playground turned into a rehearsal space. Kids practiced dances, songs, jokes, and group acts. Some of them rehearsed loudly, making sure everyone heard what they were planning to do. Others kept things secret, hoping to surprise the crowd. The boy observed everything quietly from his usual spot beneath the tree. He would place his keyboard on his lap and press the keys gently, making sure the sound didn't draw too much attention. Even though he practiced constantly, he wasn't ready for anyone to hear him, not yet. One afternoon, a group of boys passed by him. They glanced at the keyboard and one of them muttered, "Is he really taking that thing to the event?" Another shrugged and said, "He won't, he never does anything." They walked away laughing, not out of cruelty, but because they didn't think he would ever step onto a stage. Their words stayed with him longer than he expected. He knew they didn't mean harm, but the reminder stung. People were so used to him being quiet that they couldn't imagine him doing anything bold. He wondered briefly if they were right. Maybe he wasn't meant for things like this. Maybe he should watch from the crowd like always. But later that evening, as he sat alone in his room with the door closed, he played a melody he had been working on. The sound wasn't perfect, but something about it felt honest. It calmed him, grounding him in a way nothing else did. Music was the only thing that felt like his own, not borrowed, not forced, not judged. The next morning, the teacher handed out small forms for students who wanted to perform at the event. The boy held the blank paper in his hands the entire day, folding and unfolding it as if the decision depended on how many creases it had. He kept it hidden under his notebook so no one would notice. He didn't sign it. He told himself he needed more time. That afternoon, he walked home slowly, dragging his steps as if each one weighed a little more than the last. When he reached his house, he went straight to his room and closed the door. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the folded paper. He thought of all the times someone told him to stay quiet. He remembered the teacher who once asked him to speak louder because she couldn't hear him. He remembered classmates who forgot he was standing there while they talked. He remembered moments when he wanted to say something but couldn't bring himself to open his mouth. Maybe performing could change something. Maybe it wouldn't, but the idea of doing nothing hurt more. Finally, he unfolded the paper and signed his name carefully, as if his hand needed time to believe what it was doing. He handed the form to the teacher the next morning. She looked at him in mild surprise but smiled warmly and said, "I'm glad you're joining." Her voice was gentle, without expectation or doubt. It made him feel a little lighter. But signing up didn't make everything easier. If anything, it made things more real. For the next few days, he rehearsed more seriously. He adjusted rhythms, corrected mistakes, and rewrote small pieces of his song. His fingers moved faster and smoother each time. Sometimes he felt proud. Sometimes he felt terrified. But he kept going. The day before the event, there was a full rehearsal at the town park. Kids gathered on the grass while adults set up a small stage, speakers, and lights. The sun was bright, and the air felt warm. Families walked around, some bringing food and blankets. The boy arrived quietly with his keyboard in a backpack. He sat on one of the benches near the back, watching the others rehearse. The stage looked bigger in real life than it did in his imagination, and seeing other performers go up with such confidence made him question himself again. A group of girls practiced a dance routine. A boy with a guitar played a cheerful tune while people clapped. Someone performed a short comedy act. Even though the jokes weren't very funny, everyone still laughed to encourage him. When it was the boy's turn, one of the volunteers called out his name. He froze for a second, his legs stiff and unwilling to move. Finally, he forced himself to stand. He walked toward the stage, each step feeling heavier than the last. He climbed the small stairs and placed his keyboard on the stand. His hands trembled slightly. He pressed one key, then another, testing the sound. The speakers made the notes louder than he had ever heard them. It startled him. "Whenever you're ready," the volunteer said. The boy took a slow breath. He tried to start the melody, but his fingers felt stiff. He hit the wrong key. He tried again, but the sound felt off. His heartbeat grew louder in his ears. After a few seconds, he stepped back from the stand. "I'll practice more at home," he whispered. Though barely anyone heard him, the volunteer nodded kindly and told him it was okay. But the boy could tell that some people watching were confused. A few kids whispered to each other, wondering why he signed up if he couldn't even play during rehearsal. He left the stage with a tight feeling in his chest. He walked back to his bench and packed his keyboard quickly. He didn't want anyone to see the disappointment on his face. The moment he reached home, he locked himself in his room and sat on the floor with his keyboard. He felt embarrassed, even though no one had laughed at him. He felt frustrated, even though no one had scolded him. Mostly, he felt afraid that he would freeze again the next day. But after sitting in silence for a long while, he lifted his keyboard again. He placed his fingers on the keys, closed his eyes, and played his melody softly. It sounded shaky at first, but slowly it grew steadier. He practiced late into the night. Every time he thought about the stage, his chest tightened, but he kept playing. He reminded himself that this wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about proving something to kids who barely noticed him. It was about giving himself a chance he never allowed himself before. When he finally went to bed, exhaustion pulled him into sleep quickly, but his hands tingled with the memory of each note. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but he felt the weight of the day already. Today was the event. Today he had to face the stage again. He stared at his keyboard for a long moment before picking it up. He ran his fingers across the keys gently, as if asking them for courage. Then he packed it carefully and headed to school, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his stomach. Everyone was excited. Students wore colorful clothes, some already carrying props or instruments. Teachers prepared the final list of performers. The playground buzzed louder than usual. When a classmate saw the keyboard sticking out of the boy's backpack, he raised an eyebrow and asked, "You're actually performing?" The boy didn't say anything. He simply nodded. The classmate's surprise softened into a smile. "Good luck," he said. Those two simple words gave the boy a small spark of confidence. On the walk to the park with his class, he stayed near the back as usual. But this time, instead of looking down, he looked ahead at the stage being set up in the distance. He could already see people gathering: families, friends, neighbors. The crowd looked bigger than yesterday. His heart raced again, but he kept walking. He wasn't sure what would happen. He didn't know if he would freeze again or if he would find courage at the right moment. But he had already taken the first steps. He signed up. He practiced. He showed up. And now, standing near the edge of the park with the sound of chatter growing louder, he felt something surprising. He felt ready to try, not to prove anything, not to impress anyone, but to finally let his music be heard. The morning of the event arrived with a mix of excitement and nervousness filling the air of the entire town. People moved around with cheerful energy, setting up food stalls, ranging chairs in rows, hanging colorful banners, and testing the sound system for the performances. The park buzzed with life, and even from a distance, it felt like a day that everyone had been looking forward to. The boy walked alongside his class, his keyboard strapped tightly to his back. His steps were steady, but his mind was spinning with questions. Would he freeze again? Would people laugh? Would he regret signing up? The closer they got to the park, the louder the chatter became, and each sound seemed to echo inside his chest. As they arrived, he saw several families already seated on blankets spread across the grass. Small children ran around with balloons, and groups of teenagers practiced their acts in corners of the park. The stage was bigger than it looked the day before, and the speakers beside it seemed almost intimidating. But the boy tried to steady his breathing. Teachers guided students to their designated waiting areas. The boy found a quiet corner near a tree where he placed his backpack down carefully. He checked his keyboard, wiping away a bit of dust and making sure each key worked. His fingers shook a little, but he continued anyway, while he tuned the volume. A few classmates walked over. One of them, who usually talked a lot, said, "So you're really going through with it, huh?" The boy gave a small nod. The classmate smiled. "Good, you've got something different. I hope you show it today." Those words felt strange but warm. People weren't used to encouraging him, so even a simple comment meant more than anyone could guess. He nodded again, though his voice stayed quiet. One by one, students went up on stage. There were dances, songs, jokes, and even a magic trick that didn't work properly. But the audience clapped anyway. Families cheered loudly for their children, and the atmosphere felt lighthearted and supportive. Meanwhile, the boy watched each performance, his heart thumping harder as his turn grew closer. He kept practicing small parts of his melody on his keyboard to stay focused. Every few minutes, he glanced at the stage and wondered if he would be able to walk up there without his legs giving out. He tried to remind himself of why he wanted to do this. It wasn't for applause. It wasn't for attention. It was because his music meant something to him. It was the only thing that ever helped him speak without words. Still, fear doesn't disappear just because we understand our reasons. Eventually, his name was called. He froze. For a second, he felt like his entire body had turned to stone. The crowd continued clapping from the previous act, and suddenly everything felt too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. A teacher walked up to him and said gently, "It's your turn. You can do this." There was no pressure in her voice, just encouragement. He managed a slow nod. With trembling hands, he picked up his keyboard and walked toward the stage. The path felt longer than usual, and his heartbeat echoed in his ears like a drum. He stepped onto the small stairs, careful not to trip, and reached the top. The audience looked peaceful, not judging, just waiting. Parents held snacks, kids sat cross-legged on the grass, and several teachers stood near the back. It wasn't a crowd of critics, it was a community. Still, the boy felt like the entire world was watching. He placed his keyboard on the stand, adjusted it, and wiped his hands on his pants quietly. He tested one key, then another. The speakers played the notes loudly, and that familiar shock ran through him again. He swallowed hard. The volunteer near the stage gave him a thumbs up. The boy closed his eyes. He tried to find that feeling he always had in his room at night when no one could hear him, when music was nothing but comfort. He tried to breathe like he did when practicing alone, slow and steady. Then, with a deep breath, he started playing. The first note was soft, unsure, almost shaky. He hit it lightly, careful not to press too hard. The second note came a bit clearer, then the third. Slowly, the melody began to form. He opened his eyes slightly, scanning the crowd. No one laughed, no one whispered. They simply listened. His fingers found the rhythm he had practiced again and again. With each passing second, his confidence grew. The melody became stronger, smoother. The timid beginning turned into something gentle yet emotional, as if each note carried pieces of his heart outward into the world. People in the crowd began to sit up a little taller. Parents paused in conversations. A few kids leaned forward. The sound wasn't loud or dramatic, it was soft, warm, and honest. And something about that gentleness pulled listeners in. The boy stopped looking at the audience. He focused on his keyboard, letting the music guide him. He moved through the melody the way he imagined it late at night in his room, when nobody knew how deeply he felt the notes. As the song grew, his hands moved faster, gliding smoothly across the keys. His nerves didn't disappear completely, but they faded just enough for the music to take over. He poured his feelings into every note, the loneliness, the quietness, the hidden hope, and the dreams he never spoke aloud. People who had expected very little from him were suddenly drawn in. The boy who barely spoke was now communicating through sound in a way words never allowed him to. The final part of his psalm was delicate, a soft ending he had created to feel like a whisper. When he reached those notes, he slowed his pace, letting the melody drift gently into silence. When the last note faded, the entire park stayed quiet, not because they were unimpressed, but because they were stunned for a long moment. No one moved. The boy stood still, his hands hovering above the keyboard, unsure of what to do. His heart pounded, waiting for a reaction. Then, all at once, the clapping began, loud, strong, and genuine. A wave of applause filled the air. Parents stood up. Children shouted in excitement. Some teachers wiped their eyes silently. People smiled at him, not out of politeness, but out of true admiration. The boy blinked in disbelief. It felt unreal. The noise around him wasn't overwhelming now, it felt warm, like sunlight after a long winter. He stepped back from the keyboard, trying to steady his breathing. A teacher came up to the stage and whispered, "You did wonderfully." As he walked down the stairs, he felt lightheaded, not from fear, but from relief and joy. Several classmates approached him with smiles, saying things like, "That was amazing," or "I didn't know you could play like that." Even the ones who usually ignored him looked at him differently now. For the first time, he felt seen. He went back to his quiet corner under the tree and sat down. He placed his keyboard in his lap, running his fingers across the cool plastic surface. His hands were still shaking a little, not from fear, but from the rush of everything that had just happened. As he sat there, he watched the crowd enjoying the rest of the performances. People seemed happier, as if the music had warmed the entire atmosphere. He didn't need anything more. Not praise, not attention, not fame. All he wanted was this, a moment where his voice, the one that lived inside his music, finally reached others. He leaned back against the tree, letting the sounds of the event fill the space around him. Kids laughing, parents chatting, performers preparing, it all blended into a comfort he never expected to feel. In that moment, he realized something important. He had spent his whole life being told to stay quiet. But today, his music spoke. And the world listened. The applause from the crowd stayed with the boy long after he walked off the stage. It echoed in his mind like a warm reminder that something had shifted, not just around him, but inside him. For once, he didn't feel like the quiet kid who blended into the background. For once, he felt like someone people genuinely wanted to hear. But as the excitement around the event continued, the boy wasn't sure what to do with all the attention. People kept coming up to him, parents he didn't know, kids from other classes, even teachers who had rarely spoken to him before. They praised his performance, complimented his skill, and some even asked how long he had been playing. The boy answered in short sentences, his voice soft as always. Speaking still didn't come easily, even if playing music did. But nobody seemed bothered by his quietness. They didn't rush him or expect him to speak loudly. They simply listened. For the first time, his quietness wasn't seen as a weakness. It was just part of who he was. Still, with all the praise around him, he felt a strange mix of joy and discomfort. He wasn't used to being noticed, and part of him still felt like he didn't deserve all the attention. What if they expected him to be great every time? What if he couldn't repeat what he did on stage? What if it was all just luck? Those thoughts sat heavy in his mind as the afternoon went on. After the performances ended, students were free to walk around the park. Food stalls filled the area with the smell of warm snacks, and kids formed groups to play games. Laughter floated through the air like music. The boy wandered quietly, holding his keyboard close to his chest. He didn't know where to go or who to talk to. Crowds still made him nervous, even if they weren't judging him. He found a small bench near the edge of the park, half hidden behind a row of bushes. It was peaceful there, away from the noise and excitement. He sat down and rested his keyboard beside him. As he looked out at the event, he couldn't help but replay the moment he started his performance, the shaky first note, the slow build, and then the part where his hands finally stopped trembling. It felt like he had stepped into a different version of himself that day. He wondered if that version still existed now that he was off the stage. While he sat deep in thought, a shadow moved beside him. He glanced up and saw one of the teachers from another grade. She smiled warmly and said, "Do you mind if I sit here?" The boy shook his head. The teacher sat down calmly, not crowding him. She looked toward the families gathering their things and the children running around. "You played beautifully today," she said. "Your music had emotion. That's rare, especially at your age." The boy lowered his eyes shyly. His fingers played with the corner of his keyboard case. "Thank you," he whispered. The teacher continued, Have you ever thought about taking formal lessons? I know someone in town who teaches piano. You could learn so much more." He hadn't considered it before. He had always taught himself watching videos, listening to songs, and practicing late at night when the house was quiet. The idea of sitting in a room with a teacher felt intimidating. "I don't know if I'm good enough," he said quietly. The teacher shook her head gently. "You're more than good enough. You have something special, and special things grow better when they're nurtured." Her words stayed with him long after she stood up and left. He continued sitting on the bench, thinking about them. Could he really learn more? Could he get better? Could music be something bigger in his life? He didn't know yet, but imagining the possibility made his heart feel full. After a while, a group of kids from his class approached him, calling out his name. They ran toward him with bright smiles. "We've been looking for you," one of them said. "You disappeared right after your performance." He shrugged lightly. "I just needed some air." "Well, we're going to get snacks," another said. "Come with us." They spoke casually, as if inviting him was the most natural thing in the world. The boy hesitated. He wasn't used to being included, but something inside him whispered that maybe he should try. He stood slowly and followed them. They walked past the food stalls, choosing snacks and pulling him along with them. They talked about the event, the funny moments, the performances they liked, and eventually, about his song. "I didn't know you had that in you," one of the boys said in a sincere tone. "You were incredible." The boy felt his cheeks warm. "I just practiced a lot. You should perform more," another added. People loved it. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply gave a small smile. As the sun began to set, the event came to an end. Families headed home, carrying blankets and leftover snacks. The town's volunteers packed up tables and chairs. Teachers gathered students for their final head count. The boy walked with his class, holding his keyboard close. He felt different than he had in the morning, lighter somehow, like something inside him that had been stuck for a long time finally started to move. On the way home, he looked up at the sky. The clouds were turning soft shades of orange and pink. The world felt calm, like it was gently settling into evening. When he reached his house, he went straight to his room. He placed his keyboard on the bed and sat beside it, running his hand across the keys. For the first time, he wasn't practicing to hide from the world. He wasn't playing to escape his quietness or ease his fears. He wanted to play because his music had touched people, because it had spoken for him, because it had shown a side of him he didn't know he was brave enough to share. He closed his eyes and let his fingers glide gently over the keys. A new melody began to take shape, soft, hopeful, a little unsure, but full of something real. He played for a long time, letting the emotion of the day settle. As the notes filled his small room, he felt a calm he hadn't felt in years. Later that night, while lying in bed, he thought about what the teacher had said, about learning more, about growing, about possibilities he had never dared to imagine. Maybe the boy who was always told to stay quiet didn't have to remain quiet forever. Maybe he had found another way to speak, and maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning of something much bigger. As he drifted to sleep, the last thing he heard wasn't the sound of applause or voices or doubts. It was the memory of his own music, still echoing softly in his heart. The moment the last note faded, the entire room stayed frozen. It was as if everyone was afraid that even a breath might break the magic that had just settled over them. For a few long seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. They simply stood there, trying to understand how someone they barely noticed before had just given them one of the most beautiful performances they had ever heard. He slowly lifted his hands from the keys, unsure of what would happen next. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The silence made him nervous. Did they like it? Did he make a mistake? Maybe the pause meant he had disappointed them after all. All the doubts he had carried for years rushed back into his mind. Then, suddenly, someone clapped. One single clap, then another, and another. In seconds, the entire room erupted into applause so loud it almost shook the walls. People stood up from their chairs. Some were cheering, others wiping tears, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even covered their mouths, amazed that the quiet boy they had ignored for years had just given a performance that none of them would forget. He didn't know what to do. He sat there, frozen. The applause washed over him like a wave. He felt both overwhelmed and relieved. It didn't seem real. He looked around the room, seeing so many faces changed, not in judgment, but in admiration. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. People rushed toward the stage. The organizers, who had earlier brushed him aside, were now smiling as though they had believed in him all along. One of them came forward, holding the microphone, trying to calm the crowd. "I think we all owe him an apology," the organizer said with a shaky voice. "We underestimated him. All of us did." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone else shouted, "Play another one." Another voice echoed, "Yes, play more." He felt nervous again. He hadn't prepared anything else. He didn't even expect to be allowed to play once, let alone twice. But watching the excitement in their eyes, he felt something warm grow inside him, a kind of courage he had never felt before. He gently nodded. The room hushed immediately. Waiting, he placed his fingers back on the keys and let them move. This time, he didn't hold back. He didn't play quietly. He didn't shrink into himself. He let the music flow out with full emotion, as though he was telling the story of every moment he had ever felt small, every time he had been told to stay quiet, every dream he kept hidden because he thought no one cared. And the room felt it. Every note carried something real, something honest, something human. When he finished the second piece, the applause was even louder than before. Some people were crying openly now. Adults who once dismissed him were walking up to the stage with pride in their eyes. It felt strange, but wonderful. A group of teenagers approached him first. They were the same ones who had quietly laughed when he brought in his old keyboard. One of them spoke for the groupie. "Hey, we're really sorry about earlier. You're amazing, really." He nodded gently. He wasn't angry anymore. The music had washed all of that away. Then another older man approached him. He introduced himself politely and explained that he helped organize community events, and he wanted the boy to perform again in the future. Not as a replacement performer, not as a last-minute choice, but as a headline. The boy almost didn't believe it. He felt a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. All his life, people had told him to stay quiet, told him that music was just a small hobby, told him that his passion didn't matter. And now, here was someone asking him to perform for the whole community as if he were someone important. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded again. More people came forward. Some wanted to congratulate him. Some wanted to shake his hand. Some wanted to tell him how deeply the music had touched them. A few shared stories of their own, things they had kept inside themselves, things his performance made them think about. Through all of it, he felt something inside him shift. He had always believed that being quiet meant he had nothing special, but now he understood something important. His voice had never been missing. It was just waiting inside the piano. As the crowd eventually began to settle down and return to their seats, he stepped off the stage slowly, still unsure if any of this was real. His hands were trembling, but not from fear this time. This was something else, something like happiness, something warm and growing outside the building. The evening air felt cool and soft. He took a deep breath, letting the fresh air calm him. The sounds of applause still echoed in his mind. He knew he would remember this night forever. As he stood there, a small group of younger kids approached him shyly. They looked up at him the way he once looked at older musicians online, admiring them from afar. One of the kids asked quietly, "Can you teach us to play like you?" He didn't know how to answer at first. No one had ever asked him something like that, but he smiled softly and told them he would try. They looked thrilled. In that moment, he realized how much everything had changed. He didn't feel invisible now. He didn't feel small. He didn't feel like someone who should keep his music hidden. He felt like someone who had something to share. Someone who mattered. As he walked home, carrying his old keyboard under his arm, he felt lighter than he ever had before. The world around him seemed brighter. The sky looked wider, and every step he took felt like he was walking toward a future he once believed was impossible. When he reached home, he placed the keyboard on his desk. He stared at the keys for a long moment, remembering how many hours he had spent practicing alone, dreaming quietly, hoping someone might hear him one day. And finally, someone had, more than someone. An entire room. He sat down and played again, not for the crowd, not for praise, but simply because it made him happy, because it was who he was, because playing the piano was the truest part of his heart. And he promised himself something that night. He would never let anyone silence his music again, not even himself.